The fog hung low over the Seine, that damp Parisian fog which seemed to creep into one's bones and dim even the nearest lamp. At such hours the city itself whispered as though reluctant to reveal its secrets. Somewhere beyond the shadows, the clock of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled, the sound hollow against the drizzle. Maigret stood at the corner, pipe glowing faintly, his eyes fixed not on the river but on the silhouettes moving past, men and women wrapped in overcoats, their collars raised, their steps muffled against the wet cobbles. He felt the familiar weight of silence, silence not of peace but of expectancy, as though the night itself held its breath for a truth unwilling to emerge. And in that silence, and there was the faintest echo of voices, half-heard words from a café window across the street, where the conversations of strangers carried the weight of unfinished confessions. Paris, like the case before him, was never in a hurry to surrender. If you are drawn into this atmosphere, into the quiet gravity of Maigret's world, where every puff of smoke and every lingering pause seems to hide an untold story, I invite you to stay with us. Like a confidant seated in the corner of the café, listening to a conversation that might suddenly change its tone, your presence deepens the story. If the cadence of this voice speaks to you, if the river of Paris and the worn steps of Maigret's shoes feel alive, then let your support be known. Share, subscribe, and keep the lamp burning so this story can continue to unfold before you. The café stood at the corner like an old witness, its facade faded, its awning sagging slightly under the weight of Parisian damp. The Rue de Martyrs stretched uphill, narrow and uneven, a street that carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from chimneys above. Evening had wrapped itself over Montmartre with a heavy hand, and the lamps along the street flickered against the mist, as though reluctant to burn. Inside, warmth and chatter offered a fragile refuge, though every word spoken seemed to dissolve quickly into the dense air, unfinished, unclaimed. Maigret entered without hurry, shoulders stooped against the weather, pipe clenched in his teeth. The place smelled of spilled beer, damp coats, and Gauloises. A film of condensation blurred the windows, leaving the outside world half erased. The inspector hung his hat on a wooden peg, his eyes already absorbing the scene, not as a policeman might interrogate it, but as a man accustomed to listening to silences as much as to speech. He ordered a calvados, his voice gruff but calm, and settled near the back where the stove radiated its tired heat. The conversations were many, but all seemed to carry an undercurrent of restraint. Two students in threadbare coats leaned over a chessboard, their voices rising in mock argument before sinking again into muttered confidences. A pair of older men, their moustaches damp with drink, argued politics with half-hearted conviction, though each pause betrayed more weariness than passion. And by the window sat a woman alone, her gloved hands folded on the table, staring at the door as if waiting for someone who might not arrive. Maigret watched her only in passing, not with curiosity, but with the awareness that certain figures in such places often became the axis around which the night would turn. It was Janvier who had mentioned the café earlier that day, with a casual remark about odd gatherings reported by neighbours. Nothing criminal, nothing worth a formal report, just a sense that people came and went at peculiar hours, conversations ending abruptly whenever someone unfamiliar entered. That was enough to bring Maigret here, not on official duty, but on that instinct of his which told him that mysteries seldom announce themselves with fanfare. They lingered instead in half-finished sentences and in the silence that followed them. The calvados warmed his chest. He loosened his scarf and leaned back, his pipe glowing faintly as he drew in the smoke. His eyes travelled slowly from table to table, resting not on gestures but on pauses, The way a man tapped his glass without drinking, the way another glanced too often at the clock above the bar. The cafe keeper, a stout woman with tired eyes, polished glasses with unnecessary vigor, her movements betraying an unease that no one else seemed to notice. It was as though she, too, waited for something unsaid to be spoken. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and a man in a rain-darkened overcoat. He shook himself like a dog, muttered a greeting, and sat near the woman by the window. Their exchange began with the awkward stiffness of strangers, though their eyes betrayed recognition. Words were exchanged in low tones, too soft for Maigret to hear, but the tension in their posture spoke volumes. The woman's gloved hands trembled slightly. The man leaned forward, his face tense, as if every phrase demanded careful calculation. And then, an interruption. Another customer entered, laughing too loudly, clapping the waiter on the shoulder. In an instant, the couple's conversation broke off, their faces rearranging themselves into masks of indifference. An unfinished conversation caught in the net of circumstance. Maigret puffed slowly, his gaze steady but unreadable. He felt that faint tightening in his chest, that old intuition telling him he had stumbled into the first act of a story that would not let him go. He did not know yet whether it was crime or merely tragedy, whether the café harbored conspirators or lovers, but the silence that followed their broken dialogue carried more weight than words. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels hissing on the wet cobbles, and for a moment the noise filled the void. Then the café returned to its subdued rhythm, though the unfinished words lingered like smoke above the tables. The waiter brought Maigret a fresh drink without being asked, his eyes quick to avoid meeting the inspectors. Perhaps he already knew who Maigret was. Most Parisians did, at least those who lived close enough to hear whispers from the Quai des Orfèvres. The inspector offered a faint nod, no more. He was not here to disturb the surface, not yet. He preferred to let the ripples form on their own, to see who leaned closer to whom, who grew restless under silence. The woman rose at last, her coat draped neatly over her shoulders, and departed with a glance so brief it might have been accidental. The man remained, staring at the dregs of his drink, his hand tightening around the glass, as though it were the only thing anchoring him. When he finally stood, he left without paying, a small gesture that made the café keeper frown but say nothing. Maigret marked it silently, a man distracted or a man accustomed to someone else settling his accounts. The difference often was telling. The inspector remained until the stove died to embers, until the students abandoned their chess game and the politicians grew too drowsy to quarrel. Only then did he rise, replace his hat, and step out into the fog. The Rue des Martyrs was darker now, the shops shuttered, the air heavy with drizzle. He stood for a long moment under the awning, pipe clenched between his teeth, watching the vague outlines of figures vanishing into the night. Somewhere behind him, in the café, conversations had ended without conclusions, their echoes following him like unspoken questions. As he began his slow descent toward the boulevard, he felt the case, if one could call it that, settle into him. It was not yet a matter of reports or procedures, but of atmosphere, of that particular gravity he recognized from so many other beginnings. A woman's tremor, a man's unpaid drink, a glance too quickly averted. All these were fragments of something larger, something that would draw him further in before it released its hold. He walked on, pipe smoke curling into the damp air, already knowing he would return to that café. For conversations left unfinished have a way of demanding their end. And as the bells of a distant church tolled the hour, Maigret disappeared into the fog, carrying with him the first threads of a story the city had only begun to whisper. The rain had not ceased since dawn. It fell in a steady, unyielding curtain, flattening the pavements of Paris until the gutters overflowed and the sound of dripping water filled every courtyard. At Quai des Orfèvres, the damp air seeped even through the thick walls, and the smell of wet wool and extinguished matches lingered in the corridor. Maigret sat at his desk, his pipe clamped between his teeth, watching the blurred outlines of the river through the window. Across the room, Lucas scribbled notes, his brow furrowed, while Janvier tapped the heel of his boot against the floor with a restlessness that betrayed more boredom than urgency. It was the kind of morning when the city itself seemed weary, and yet Maigret knew that such weariness often concealed the first movements of something unexpected. At 10:30, the door opened and a boy appeared, drenched from head to toe, his cap dripping and his fingers clutching a yellow envelope. He hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting toward Maigret, unsure whether he should enter. The inspector motioned him in with the faintest tilt of his head. The boy's shoes squelched on the tiles as he advanced, and when he placed the telegram on the desk, his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from cold. Without a word, he turned and left, leaving a trail of water behind him. The envelope bore no particular markings, just the usual smudged ink of provincial offices, and the faint crease where it had been folded too quickly. Maigret studied it for a moment before tearing it open. The message was brief, written in uneven characters that the rain had begun to blur. Come at once. Rue des Martyrs. Conversation unfinished. Danger. No name, no signature. Just those words as stark as they were strange. Maigret read them twice, his lips tightening around the stem of his pipe. He could almost smell the ink, the hurried hand that had pressed these letters, the anxiety hidden behind the clumsy brevity. Janvier leaned forward. "Is it another anonymous warning, Chief?" he asked, his tone halfway between curiosity and fatigue. Maigret did not answer immediately. He folded the telegram, placed it beside the ashtray, and sat back in his chair. "Anonymous, yes," he said at last, "but not meaningless." His voice was low, measured. He felt the weight of those words in a way he could not explain. Something about the phrasing, about the insistence on unfinished conversation, struck him with a familiarity that went beyond coincidence. It echoed the atmosphere of the café, the murmured dialogue broken off when the door had opened. A thread was forming, tenuous but undeniable. Lucas frowned. Could be a prank, some student with too much time. "Perhaps," Maigret murmured. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray, scattering a small rain of ashes. But even a prank has a source, and in this city chance often disguises itself as fate. The rain grew heavier, hammering against the windows. Outside, the Seine churned, swollen and restless, its surface mottled with rings of falling drops. Maigret rose slowly, pulling his coat from the hook, and signalled to Janvier. "Come," he said simply. "We'll take a walk to Rue des Martyrs. If someone wishes us to listen, we must at least hear the silence." The streets glistened like mirrors, reflecting the dim light of lamps still burning in late morning. Horses snorted under dripping harnesses, and umbrellas bobbed like dark mushrooms in the crowd. As they climbed toward Montmartre, the inspector's boots struck the cobbles with steady rhythm, his pipe smoke curling against the drizzle. He did not speak, and Janvier, sensing his chief's mood, followed in silence, his own collar turned high against the rain. Rue des Martyrs was as Maigret remembered it from the night before, though now the fog had given way to rain. The café's awning sagged, water dripping steadily from its edge. A few passers-by hurried along, their heads bowed, but the street felt deserted, the usual noise of vendors and children dampened into nothingness. Maigret paused under the awning, staring at the familiar window blurred by moisture. Inside, the café looked nearly empty, just the keeper behind the counter, wiping glasses with her habitual unease. He pushed open the door and stepped in, shaking droplets from his coat. The warmth inside was more a matter of comparison than reality. The stove burned weakly, and the air smelled of damp tobacco. The woman glanced up, recognition flickering in her tired eyes. She did not greet him, but her shoulders stiffened, as though bracing for questions she could not avoid. Maigret approached the counter, set the folded telegram on the wood, and asked quietly, "Do you know anything of this?" She read the blurred lines with deliberate slowness, her lips pressing together. "I know nothing, monsieur," she said at last, though her voice lacked conviction. Her hands moved restlessly with the cloth, polishing the same glass again and again. "People come here, they speak, they leave. I am not their confessor." "But you hear?" Maigret said gently. "And you notice?" Last night, a woman sat by the window. A man joined her. They spoke in low voices. "Who are they?" The café keeper hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the empty tables. "I do not know their names. They come sometimes, not together, but they notice each other, that much is clear. She is always waiting, he always uncertain." "Unfinished conversations," Maigret murmured. The phrase tasted strange on his tongue, like a code meant to draw him further in. He pocketed the telegram again, then ordered another calvados, not because he wanted it, but because it would loosen tongues. The woman poured, her hands less steady than before. Janvier had drifted toward the back, inspecting the stove, the chessboard left abandoned, the damp marks on the benches where coats had rested. He returned with a shrug. "Nothing unusual this morning," he whispered. "Nothing visible," Maigret corrected. He drank slowly, letting the warmth of the calvados cut through the damp in his chest. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming. He imagined the provincial telegraph office, some dim-lit room where a clerk had accepted this message, where a stranger had pressed coins into his palm with nervous haste. He imagined the hand that had written the words, ink running slightly under the weight of anxiety. The city was full of unfinished stories, but rarely did they announce themselves so directly. As they left the café, Maigret lingered at the threshold, pipey, smoke mixing with the damp air. The telegram felt heavy in his pocket, though it weighed no more than paper. He glanced up the street where water streamed downhill like a narrow river, and for a moment he thought he saw the silhouette of a man in a light-coloured hat watching from the corner. But when he stepped closer, the figure vanished into the rain, leaving only the echo of footsteps against stone. They walked back toward the Seine in silence. Janvier, at last, dared to ask, "Do you believe there's real danger, Chief?" Maigret exhaled slowly, smoke escaping with his words. "Danger is always real when someone chooses silence over speech. What matters is not the telegram itself, but the fear that sent it. Fear leaves traces. We shall follow them." The inspector's broad shoulders hunched slightly under the rain, but his pace remained steady. Behind him, Paris whispered with every drop, every blurred lamp, every hurried glance of passers-by. Somewhere in that whisper, a voice waited to be heard, a conversation unfinished, now calling him more insistently than ever. Gare du Nord breathed like a great animal in foul weather, its glass ribs sweating with condensation, its iron bones creaking as if the wind itself had weight. The afternoon had turned the colour of pewter, and the station swallowed that dimness without complaint. Steam rose in folds from the locomotives idling under the vaulted roof, blurring faces, softening uniforms, turning the black of coats into damp charcoal. Vendors cried out with weary insistence, selling newspapers whose headlines ran with rain, and the echo of footsteps on stone made a scatter of hard, impatient sounds that refused to settle. Maigret, collar up, moved at the slow, stubborn pace of a man who has come not for a departure, but for a pause that might reveal a name. He had not announced his visit to anyone. No summons had been issued, no orders scrawled in haste on desk blotter paper. A telegram had demanded attention. The café had offered a silence thick as wool. Now the station promised that particular strain of truth one finds only in places of transit, where people become shadows of themselves, lighter by what they leave behind. Janvier trailed him at a respectful distance, careful not to intrude on the inspector's solitude, for it was in such solitude that Maigret's attention grew most precise. He neither hunted nor waited. He merely breathed with the place until it opened itself. A whistle blew, thin and petulant. A porter pushed a cart stacked with valises whose leather gleamed like wet bark. Two gendarmes shared a cigarette near a kiosk, their conversation barely moving, as if the tobacco were more eloquent than either of them. From the outer doors the station admitted a gust of rain, and with it a scattering of latecomers, shoulders damp, hats tilted low. Among them Maigret noticed a man whose stride did not match his urgency. He wore a narrow-brimmed hat the colour of dust, and a coat buttoned to the throat. He did not look around him. He looked through as if the air were a glass pane, and all the others were mere reflections. There was nothing remarkable in the man's face. Pale, slightly pinched at the nostrils, cheeks that did not retain colour. But the way he held his gloves told a story. He did not wear them. He let them dangle, the fingertips darkened by use, the leather softened at the fold where he worried them between forefinger and thumb. He paused near the timetable with the indifference of one who already knows his hour and destination. The steam, drifting and pale, crossed his features like the passing of a mood. He was not young, he was not old. If one had to say, one would say he was temporarily suspended from age, as travellers sometimes are. Maigret stopped within 2 paces of a newspaper stall and pretended to read. He did not look directly at the man. Instead, he observed the empty spaces around him, those small pools of vacancy that careful people create when they wish not to be touched. The man's silence had weight. It sent a small pressure outward, persuading passers-by to tilt, to drift. The inspector had seen such a thing before in waiting rooms where guilty men sat with hands too still, or in cafés where lovers held their voices too low. He drew on his pipe and let the smoke coil upward, a deliberate softness amid the station's iron. The man with the gloves moved again, not toward a platform, but toward the ticket windows, where a queue formed and broke and reformed as trains were announced. He waited his turn without impatience. When he reached the little brass grill, he leaned in, not to speak confidentially, but to shelter his words from the room, and asked for a ticket to Beauvais. His voice carried just enough for Maigret to be sure of the name. The inspector said nothing. Beauvais meant nothing yet, only that the man chose a provincial town that could be reached in a handful of hours, a place that would not ask too many questions of a stranger, a place where the rain would smell of wet stone and cabbage. "Do you want me to follow?" Janvier's voice brushed Maigret's ear without touching it. The younger man stood as if examining pocket watches in the case of a nearby kiosk. "Not yet," Maigret said, almost without moving his lips. "He may not intend to leave." The ticket slid across the polished wood with a delicate rasp. The man took it without looking down, as if it were not a ticket, but permission to continue being himself. He did not turn toward the platforms. He turned into the station's belly, where a long corridor led past the telegraph office, the toilettes, the door behind which porters drank black coffee, and the little bar that smelled of anise and old bread. He paused in the corridor's mid-gloom and took from his pocket a folded paper that was not the ticket. He unfolded and refolded it twice. Not nerves, habit. The paper had been folded so often it knew how to crease itself. At the telegraph window, a clerk with red fingers and an ink-stained cuff looked up with the weariness of a man who has seen every variety of misfortune pass his counter disguised as brevity. The man with the gloves handed him a form already filled out. The clerk read and did not change expression. He stamped the top with a dull thud and reached for the message with the mechanical tenderness of a priest taking confession. The man paid in coins, counted not once but twice, then stepped aside. He did not wait for confirmation. One does not wait for a telegram to arrive. One waits for it to have been sent. Maigret's pipe had gone out. He did not relight it. He let his hands rest in his pockets, a gesture that on any other man might have seemed careless, but on him meant patience. He approached the clerk only after the line returned to its natural pace, as if he had decided to erase himself from observation, and was now available to reappear. The clerk looked up and sighed, not from annoyance, but from the sensation of being nudged by the world. "A wet day for messages," Maigret said in that low conversational tone which carried no obligation to reply. The clerk, without surprise, recognized the inspector. It was the recognition of a desk-bound man who reads the city by the names he writes on forms. "It always rains for the urgent ones," he said, sliding a blotter across fresh ink. "Too true." Maigret's eyes drifted to the forms stacked at the edge of the counter. The gentleman in the dust-coloured hat, did he send far? The clerk's features rearranged themselves into that provincial caution often found in Parisian employees. It was not fear, but policy. "I couldn't say." "Of course not." Maigret smiled without showing teeth, and something in the clerk's shoulders eased. "If it helps, I am not asking for content." "Beauvais," the clerk murmured at last, surprising himself with the concession. "Only the destination, nothing else to remember." A plausible truth or a kindness? It would do. Maigret inclined his head, thanked him, and drifted away with the same neutrality with which he had approached. The man in the dust-coloured hat had not gone to the platforms. He had entered the bar. Through the open doorway came the smell of Poirot and bitter coffee, and the sound of a glass being set down more carefully than necessary. When Maigret reached the threshold, he saw the man at the far end, beneath a mirror that returned a fogged, melancholic replica of the scene. The gloves lay on the counter, the fingertips aligned like obedient soldiers. He drank as if he were practicing. He wiped his lips with a folded handkerchief and left no smear. There was a woman at the bar too, not young, no longer young, one might say, wearing a small hat with a black veil that had lost its stiffness. She did not look at the man, and he did not look at her, but a vibration travelled between them. The bartender, a man whose hair fell forward as if it had lost interest in his skull, kept his gaze a little above their heads, where anyone who wished not to see might safely look. Maigret took a place 2 stools away from the woman. He ordered coffee he did not want, and let the saucer warm his fingertips. The woman's perfume had the tired sweetness of something bought years ago and cherished too carefully. She kept her handbag perfectly square before her, as if aligning it with the grain of the counter could make the hour pass more precisely. When the man finished his drink, he left money, more than necessary, and took up the gloves with a tenderness that did not belong to leather. He did not say goodbye. He did not nod. He passed the woman so closely the veil trembled, though there was no draught. Maigret waited a beat, then another. He rose and stepped into the corridor, the coffee unfinished. The man walked without haste toward the platforms at last, down a slope of stone made slick by shoes and steam. Platform numbers appeared and dissolved in mist. A bell chimed the way a bell does when it has no faith that anyone is listening. The train for Beauvais took a long breath and let it out. "Now, Chief?" Janvier had reappeared from nowhere, which was his best quality. "Stay with him," Maigret said. "If he boards, go to the second carriage and keep to the corridor. Don't look at him. If he does not board, follow him only until he stops walking like a traveller. And you?" Maigret's gaze had shifted to the woman in the veil, who had left the bar and stood by a column, as if columns had ever protected anyone. "I shall listen to what isn't said." The man reached the edge of the platform, paused, and stepped aboard, with the soft conviction of one who had rehearsed the movement many times in private. Janvier moved after him and vanished into the train, becoming immediately another figure in a hat, another coat, another set of boots, all neutral, all patient. Steam thickened, then tore itself into tatters as the locomotive sighed. The woman did not move. Her gloved hands tightened on the strap of her handbag until the worn leather sighed too. She did not watch the carriage. She watched the gap between train and platform, as if the void itself could yield some comfort. Maigret approached her only when the signal arm dropped and the train shuddered forward. "Madame," he said gently, because she was the kind of woman to whom one spoke gently first. "Forgive me. Do you require assistance?" Her mouth opened, not to answer, but to let out a breath she had been holding since the bar. "No," she said, and the word was untrustworthy, like a coin too light in the hand. "It's only that I dislike departures." "They are worse for those who remain," Maigret agreed. He did not ask her name. Names, at such moments, forced people to choose between truth and invention. "The rain makes everything look farther." She gave a small, absurd laugh. "Yes, it moves the stations apart." A porter pushed past with a minor apology. The woman lifted her handbag and turned as if to go, then hesitated. A question hovered at her lip, one of those small questions that can alter the size of a day. She did not ask it. Instead, she said, "You are Maigret." It was not a question. "I am." "I thought so last night," she whispered. "In the café, I wanted to speak, but the door kept opening." He waited. The train's tail lamps dwindled to red pinpricks, moving toward the rain, becoming part of it. The woman adjusted the veil that had already failed her. "There will be another conversation," she said at last, so quietly he might have imagined it. "When the weather clears." "Will it?" Maigret asked. It was unclear whether he meant the weather or the conversation. She did not answer. She moved away with a dignity that did not include straightness. Her steps were slightly uneven, as if one shoe had tired more than the other. Maigret watched until the station softened her into the general haze of people who had somewhere else to be. He turned toward the telegraph office, where the clerk already pretended not to notice him, and then to the timetable, where Beauvais printed its small, stubborn syllables in neat type. He did not follow the woman. He did not chase the train. He stood under the iron ribs of the roof and listened to the station breathe. And in that slow, hoarse breath he thought he could hear the faint scratching of a pen upon cheap paper, the rain smudging the letters, the word danger trying to remain legible. He considered going back to the café at once. He considered returning to his desk to wait for Janvier's report. He considered also the warmth of his own kitchen, the solidity of Madame Maigret setting plates on the table, the ease with which ordinary food could anchor a day that threatened to float away. When he finally turned toward the exit, the fogged mirror above the bar behind him held a thin reflection of his shape, moving through steam as if through a memory not yet named. The rain met him at the doors with the same insistence as before, the streets shining like tin. He raised his collar again and walked out into Paris, heavy-shouldered, pipe unlit, the weight of the unfinished balanced carefully between his lungs. The rain softened toward evening, not stopping, only gentling into a fine powder that made the streets seem newly forged from tin. Maigret returned across the bridges with the heaviness that followed him on days when something had been set in motion without his permission. The lamps along the quays had begun to glow, small pools of yellow that trembled in the damp, and the river went by with that quiet obstinacy which neither storm nor sun could alter. He walked without haste, not because he lacked urgency, but because he knew that any hour forced too hard would close itself against him. By the time he reached home, the front steps shone like slate. He stamped his boots twice before entering, and let the smell of cooked vegetables and warm bread reach him the way a harbour reaches a tired vessel. Madame Maigret was laying the table, hands sure, gestures small, as though an economy of movement could keep the house calm while the world exhausted itself outside. Her dress was plain and good. A brooch he had given her years ago, brass gone soft with time, held the collar neatly in place. She looked up with that quiet appraisal which says more than any question. She took his wet coat without remark, shook it out in the vestibule, and brought him the newspaper folded around a corner to avoid the worst of the damp. He sat, pipe unlit, watching the steam rise from a dish whose scent returned him to something earlier than the day. In that kitchen the world seemed almost willing to be ordinary. He told her little and enough. Not of the telegram's exact words, not of the woman at the station with the veil that trembled like a moth, not even of Janvier stepping into the second carriage as if into fog, but of atmosphere, of a café on Rue des Martyrs where voices entered a room and did not leave it whole, of a man who handled his gloves as if they might break, of rain that blurred everything written. Madame Maigret listened with the patience of one who has long understood that her husband's most urgent facts are never the first ones he remembers to say. She set a bowl before him, and in setting it, her eye arrested on a detail he had not considered worth mentioning. It always happened like that, a small pause, the slightest focusing, and something concealed in his account declared itself to her. "And they watch each other there?" she asked softly. "In that café, not like friends do?" "Not like friends," he conceded. Spoon paused halfway. "Like people measuring a distance they cannot cross in public." She placed bread on the board, cutting it with 2 quick strokes. "Then someone will choose a place where crossing is possible and not noticed. People are braver at corners than at tables." "At corners?" He looked at her with that mixture of amusement and respect he reserved for these domestic trespasses into his work. "At corners and thresholds," she said, almost to herself. "In such rain, too, under an awning at a doorway, one can hide a decision in the pretext of shelter." Her gaze drifted past him to the window where droplets clung in perfect beads. "And if there is a pharmacy nearby, people lower their voices when they step out with a parcel. A box of powders makes one private." He chewed, not the stew, but the thought. He had the café entire in his head, the chessboard half played, the students' laughter that arrived late like a train, the café keeper's hands that polished without progress. He had not noticed a pharmacy. It may have been there all the same. On those streets, pharmacies belonged like commas belong in a sentence. He saw, suddenly, the woman at the window leaving with the cautious rectitude of someone delaying collapse, and the man who stayed behind, letting the habit of his life replace the intent of his evening. A box under an arm could change a posture. It could change a night. "You're thinking of someone in particular," Madame Maigret added, not in doubt, but in permission. "A woman who dislikes departures," he said, and watched his wife's mouth turn half a degree, neither smile nor sadness. "They are worst in rain," she murmured. "They feel less like choices." He ate slowly. The steam patted his face, and he felt the frayed rope inside him ease a little. Across the street a light went on behind curtains, making a rectangle that cut the mist. Footsteps passed in the corridor. Somewhere a door closed with that hollow wood sound particular to old buildings that have expanded and contracted enough to learn patience. When his plate was nearly empty, he said, as if deciding the flavour of the stew, he bought a ticket to Beauvais. "And you did not follow," she said, not accusing. Janvier did. "Then you waited," she said, and made the sentence a comfort. He nodded. Waiting had not altered the rain's intention. He filled his pipe without lighting it, and looked at the matchbox as if it contained a message. Madame Maigret refilled his glass and spoke again, only when the silence had become a shape that could be moved without breaking. "This café," she said. "What is opposite it?" "Opposite?" "Across the street or on the next corner where people look when they are pretending not to look. Is there a tobacconist, a bakery, a small hotel whose curtains never quite meet?" He frowned, not at her, but at his own inattention. He had entered the café as one enters a confession, facing inward. He had not studied the street's outer punctuation, only its breadth. He saw a vague sign in his memory, something green, a serpent in a bowl, yes, the pharmacy's sign. And, to the right, a narrow entrance with a brass rail half dulled by palms. Hotel Saint-Clair, perhaps, or Saint something. 3 floors of rooms with thin wallpaper, patterned like last year's leaves. A bell that rang too long when pressed. He saw also a doorway deeper than necessary, a passage to a courtyard where a delivery cart might shelter. Corners and thresholds. "The hotel," he said at last. "There is a small hotel." She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already arranged. Then a conversation could become a visit by accident, a person taken ill by the rain, a room for an hour to warm up. She neither coloured nor smiled. It was not prurience, only the ordinary acceptance that people seek privacy with the excuses nearest to hand. He leaned back, the chair creaking in a way he found reassuring. "And if the hotel is a poor one?" "Better," she said. "Poor hotels know how to avoid noticing. A good hotel pretends to see everything. A poor one pretends to see nothing." He thought of the café keeper's unease, of her quick eyes that returned always to the same smudge on the same glass. If she had watched the doorway, she had watched it because she understood that those who entered did not always mean to stay, and those who left might return by the door next to it. He imagined her sweeping the threshold and not quite closing the door so that the rain could excuse a stranger's pause. He imagined the woman at the window standing in that little current of weather which belongs both to the street and to the room. They ate in companionable silence then. The room cooled a fraction as the stove drifted from its fervour into its dim red patience. When the plates were cleared, Madame Maigret brought her mending and took the chair near the lamp, glasses low on her nose. The steady bite of the needle seemed to order the air. Maigret lit his pipe at last, and the smoke rose in a thin blue ribbon, calm as a vow. On the sideboard the clock marked the quarter hour with a reserved throat-clearing. After a time he said, "If the telegram came from a provincial office, and the man purchased a ticket to Beauvais, and yet he sent another telegram,
at the station, then either his mind changes quickly or someone else's changes for him. Or he plays at both, she said without looking up. There are people who wish to be pursued but not reached. Children, he said, and she allowed herself a ghost of a smile. Also, those who fear that a decision once made might refuse to be undone. If one sends two messages with contrary winds, one can always say to oneself that fate chose which letter arrived first. He nodded. Two winds. The idea pleased him in a way that had nothing to do with ease. He rose to fetch his coat and hat, which had dried into the shape of their work. He checked his pockets by touch, notebook, pencil, telegram, folded to the exact measure of his wallet's inside, matches, a small coin that had migrated from one day to another like a thought that kept returning. He turned to his wife, who was still mending, and said with deliberate lightness, "If I find nothing, I shall bring home pears." "Do not bring pears," she replied, eyes twinkling behind the glass without angling upward. "There are pears in the pantry that have decided not to ripen and will resent strangers." He stood a moment longer, taking from her the gravity she offered, without weight. At the door he paused. "You spoke of corners," he said. "What of streetcar stops?" "They make people impatient," she said. "Impatience is noisy. Corners are patient. Go to a corner." On Rue des Martyrs the night had become a fine sieve, the rain drifting rather than falling. Under the café's awning, two men smoked without speaking, each owning his own patch of wet stone. The café keeper looked up when he entered. Her tired eyes settled, not surprised, as if she had
expected him to come once he had left, as if his absence had been only another form of presence. He ordered coffee this time. The Calvados would make the air too heavy. He did not sit, but stood near the door, watching the glass blacken and brighten with passing lamps. Opposite, the pharmacy's serpent swayed in the least wind. A woman left with a small white parcel pressed flat under her arm, walking the way people walk when a thing has feathers and must not be allowed to flutter. She did not look toward the café. She moved to the corner and paused exactly as Madame Maigret had described, half under the gutter, half out, as if her body needed to prove it could withstand both. A man approached with his hat low, and in that instant when they met he did not quite greet her. Their heads bent in parallel, and for a second the rain made a curtain between them and the street. Not the woman from the station. This one's step had less memory. The man's gloves struck the lamp's weak light as he lifted a hand. Pale gloves, not white, a grey with the dusty sheen of ash, the shade one would choose to seem invisible and thereby be seen by anyone who knew how to look. He touched two fingers to the brim of his hat in an old-fashioned courtesy that did not include warmth. They moved together toward the narrower door beside the café, the one with the brass rail dulled by palms. Hôtel Saint-Clair, the letters confirmed, their black paint chipped at the serif. Maigret drank his coffee too hot, scalding the back of his throat just enough to anchor him. He set the cup down without clatter and stepped out beneath the awning. The ash-coloured gloves disappeared into the depth of the doorway, and the door closed with a softness that belonged to places where voices are often kept below the register of notice. The café keeper, who had come to adjust the awning's rope, let her glance stray and return. She knew that door. She knew the exact measure of its silence. On the pavement, water threaded itself toward the gutter in obedient lines. A boy ran past with a bundle of newspapers wrapped in twine, his feet dealing small slaps to the stone, the rain needling his cap. Somewhere, a clock insisted on 8 in a tone that made it sound later. Maigret took his place at the corner, shoulder against stone, brim of his hat beaded with tiny worlds. He could see the pharmacy, the hotel door, the café, the windows above where occupants leaned into their rooms without drawing back the curtains. He filled his pipe and did not light it, listened to the street breathe, counted in no numbers the minutes it took for a conversation to become a decision. When the door opened, at last, it yielded only the man. The woman did not appear. The man adjusted his cuffs with that same carefulness that belonged to his gloves, then slipped those pale, ash-coloured hands back into concealment. He looked once toward the café without seeing it, and set off down the slope of the street with the unremarkable stride of one who has arranged his evening. Maigret watched him go, waited one heartbeat more, and stepped to the threshold the man had left, his hand resting on the dull brass rail as if testing a temperature. The Hôtel Saint-Clair was the kind of establishment that appeared in no guidebook and remained known only to those who needed it. Its narrow doorway stood like a slit between larger facades, a dark seam in the architecture of the street, and the brass rail beside the entrance bore the faint polish of countless anonymous hands. Inside, the hallway smelled of damp plaster and cheap polish, and the desk clerk sat half asleep behind his counter, his newspaper spread like a shield against intrusion. The ticking of a clock on the wall made the air heavier rather than lighter, as though each second demanded endurance. Maigret stepped in without a word, filling the space with the slow weight of his presence, pipe unlit but firm between his teeth. The clerk looked up, eyes watery, and opened his mouth to protest before recognizing the unmistakable bulk of the inspector. His shoulders fell not in welcome, but in the resignation of a man who understands that what is about to be asked has already been decided. Maigret did not need to raise his voice. He simply placed his broad hands on the counter and asked, "The man who just left, which room?" The clerk hesitated, but Maigret's silence pressed harder than any threat. At last the man's eyes flicked upward toward the staircase, a silent betrayal delivered with the helplessness of one accustomed to looking the other way. "Third floor," he muttered, but it was the lady who asked for the room. The inspector gave a nod, heavy with acknowledgment, and turned toward the stairs. His boots echoed on the wood, each step carrying him higher into the stale air of the building. The corridor was lined with faded wallpaper patterned with flowers that had lost their color, their outlines blurred by years of smoke and steam. The lamps, weakly burning behind frosted glass, threw halos that made the shadows larger rather than smaller. Doors stood closed on either side, each with a tarnished number nailed crookedly above the frame. Maigret's tread was deliberate, steady, the tread of a man who knew that the mere sound of his approach could shape the silence on the other side of the doors. When he reached the third floor, he paused. The carpet, worn to the weave, carried no fresh footprints, yet the air itself seemed disturbed, as if two figures had passed and left their unease behind. Room 12. The number was nearly illegible, half its paint scratched away by careless luggage or fingernails. Maigret stood before it, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Only the faint tick of pipes cooling and the sigh of rain against the roof above. He drew his pipe from his mouth, tapped the stem lightly against his palm, and knocked once with the back of his knuckle. The sound was dull, absorbed by the door. Nothing stirred within. He waited, then knocked again, more firmly. Still silence. He placed his hand on the brass handle. It yielded without resistance. The door creaked inward. The room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the street lamp filtering through thin curtains. The bed had been used but not slept in, the coverlet pulled awry, the pillow pressed with the shape of a head briefly rested. A glass stood half full on the table, beads of condensation marking the passage of time since it had been touched. On the chair near the window lay a woman's scarf, still damp from rain, its faint perfume lingering in the air, a sweetness that was already fading into melancholy. But the woman herself was gone. There remained only the impression of a presence abruptly withdrawn, like a conversation broken off at its first word. Maigret crossed the room slowly, his heavy frame careful not to disturb the fragile silence. He touched the scarf, lifted it, brought it to his face for an instant. The scent told him little, only that it belonged to someone who cherished appearances even when circumstances offered little space for elegance. He placed it back gently. On the desk by the wall lay a folded scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet. He opened it. The writing was hurried, angular, the ink blotched by haste. "Not tonight. Another time. Do not follow." No signature, no explanation. He read it twice, then folded it again with care, slipping it into his pocket. The words were as unfinished as the conversations that haunted this case, a postponement rather than a refusal, a door left ajar rather than closed. The inspector stood by the window, looking down into the street. The rain had slackened to mist, the cobblestones glistening like oilcloth. He could see the café's awning across the way, sagging under droplets. Beyond it, shadows moved, blurred by the wet glass. Somewhere among them might be the man with the ash-coloured gloves, or perhaps he had already vanished into the greater anonymity of Paris. Maigret tamped his pipe, struck a match, and let the smoke drift into the damp air of the room. He stayed there long enough for the clock downstairs to strike the quarter hour before leaving, closing the door softly behind him. Descending the staircase, he met the clerk's furtive glance and ignored it. Outside, the street smelled of wet stone and horse dung, the city's eternal perfume after rain. Maigret crossed back to the café, entered once more, and seated himself at the same table as the night before. The keeper brought him coffee without being asked. She stood a moment, her cloth twisting nervously in her hand. "The gentleman, he is not one of ours," she said finally, as though compelled to share the burden of her unease. "He comes, he looks, he waits, but he belongs somewhere else. You see it at once." Maigret nodded, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. "And the woman?" he asked. The keeper hesitated. She tries not to be noticed. That is the way of such women, but her hands betray her, always trembling, even when she laughs, especially when she laughs. She shivered slightly as though speaking of it summoned the feeling into her own fingers. The inspector thanked her with a glance. He drank his coffee slowly, eyes half closed, letting the noise of the café wash over him. The voices were ordinary, yet among them he heard the echo of unfinished words, fragments that never found their endings. A chess piece clattered against the board, someone coughed, a chair scraped the floor, and beneath it all lingered the sense that everything around him was only prologue, that the true conversation remained elsewhere, behind doors, inside telegrams folded into scarves and notes. When he left, the street had grown quieter. The lamps burned with a weary steadiness, their halos dimmed by mist. Somewhere down the slope of the Rue des Martyrs, the sound of footsteps carried, deliberate and solitary. Maigret followed at a distance, his bulk blending into shadows, his pipe glowing faintly with each breath. Ahead, the figure of the man with the ash-coloured gloves moved steadily, never looking back, never quickening his pace, as though he knew pursuit was inevitable and chose to make it part of his stride. He turned a corner, vanished, reappeared under another lamp, and kept walking, his gloves catching the faint light with every gesture. Maigret did not hurry. He allowed the distance to remain, knowing that what mattered was not the capture of the moment, but it's unfolding. He felt the city tighten around him, the fog pressing close, the whispers of doors closing, the smell of rain lifting from stone. And in that slow pursuit he sensed again the weight of unfinished truth, heavier now, as though it waited for him at the next corner, the next threshold, the next silence. The man with the ash-coloured gloves walked on, and Maigret followed, the night between them filled with questions that no one yet dared to ask. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the telegram lay on Maigret's desk like a small, stubborn riddle. It had dried into stiffness since that morning, the ink lines blurred where rain had first kissed them, the paper curled faintly at the corners. Janvier's absence still stretched like a gap across the office, his report from Beauvais not yet arrived, and Lucas, perched on a chair with his sleeves rolled, seemed to be waiting for news he could not hasten. The inspector sat heavy in his chair, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, eyes on that slip of yellow paper as though it contained an entire story disguised in brevity. He read it again, not for words, he already knew them by heart, but for tone. Come at once. Rue des Martyrs. Conversation unfinished. Danger. Written without flourishes, without punctuation beyond necessity. But in the way the words pressed against one another, he sensed an urgency that was more than mere alarm. Whoever had written it had not meant to communicate only a warning. They had meant to invoke him personally, to draw him as one draws a blade from a sheath. Maigret knew the difference. Many anonymous messages had crossed his desk over the years, some malicious, some desperate, some trivial. But this one bore the mark of someone who had not only witnessed, but also understood what they had witnessed, someone who trusted only in his particular patience. He spread the telegram flat against the blotter and leaned close. The inspector's eyes, accustomed to smoke and shadow, caught the faint indentation of the nib where the ink had faltered, not just hurried, but written on poor paper, paper too thin to hold the stroke. He thought of provincial offices where ink froze in winter and clerks warmed their fingers over stoves. He thought of the man with the ash-coloured gloves who bought a ticket, but whose destination seemed less important than his pause at the telegraph window. Had he been both sender and actor, player of both roles? Or had another hand sent the call, trembling as it formed the words, hoping he would arrive before something final sealed itself? Lucas cleared his throat, uneasy in the silence. Should I ask the post office for a trace, Chief? His question held only half of itself, for he knew as well as Maigret that the postal service guarded its discretion jealously. Maigret waved a broad hand. No, they would reply with delays and the truth would grow colder by the hour. He tapped the telegram gently, as one might test a loaf for readiness. Better to read it as it is. Then how, Chief? Lucas's impatience betrayed his youth, though his hair was already thinning at the temples. By remembering, Maigret said simply. He leaned back, pipe clamped in his teeth. By returning to the words until they tell me what I have already seen. The room darkened as the day gave way to evening. Outside, the rain slackened into a drizzle that glittered faintly in the lamplight. The sound of the river carried through the open window, a thick, sucking current against the quays, as though Paris itself breathed with effort. Maigret reached for a fresh sheet of paper and copied the telegram in his own hand. He wrote each word slowly, allowing its weight to settle into him. Come at once. The tone was not polite, not hesitant. It was a command disguised as a plea, not please, not if you can. Whoever wrote it had assumed his obedience, as though they knew he would heed no matter the cost. Then, Rue des Martyrs. No number, no café named, no hotel. just the street itself, a name heavy with history, with the ascent toward Montmartre, where secrets lodged like dust in the cracks of stone. Finally, conversation unfinished. Danger! The words did not explain the danger. They equated it with incompletion itself, as though the unfinished held menace greater than violence. To leave words unsaid was to invite catastrophe. He smoked in silence, letting the copy rest beside the original twin signals from two different hands. Then, without warning, memory returned. The woman's scarf abandoned in the hotel room, damp and perfumed with resignation. The note she had left equally brief, equally unfinished. Not tonight, another time, do not follow. He rose, paced, returned to the desk. He placed the two scraps side by side, telegram and note, one written with angular urgency, the other with curved resignation. Different hands, surely. Yet both belonged to the same unfinished rhythm, the same refusal of closure. It was as if the city itself had conspired to deny conclusions, feeding him only beginnings. The door opened then, and Janvier entered, his coat still wet, his hat dripping. He looked exhausted, his eyes ringed with the fatigue of travel. "Beauvais," he muttered, tossing his gloves onto the radiator. He didn't get off the train. "Did you?" Maigret asked quietly. "I did. I searched. No one matching him. Spoke with the station master. No telegrams arrived from Paris that matched our time. The man vanished somewhere between carriages." Janvier rubbed his face. Either he left before Beauvais, or he was never meant to arrive. Maigret nodded. The ticket was a gesture of misdirection. He gestured toward the telegram. "Meanwhile, this reaches us, tying everything back to Rue des Martyrs." Janvier picked up the copy, frowned at it, then the original. "And the woman?" "Vanished into silence," Maigret said. He rose, filled his pipe again. "But silence has weight, Janvier. It presses. And when pressed too long, it cracks." He paced to the window and looked out over the Seine. The lamps glittered on its surface, broken into shards by the restless current. He thought again of Madame Maigret's quiet words, corners and thresholds. That scarf on the chair had not been abandoned in panic. It had been left with intention, as if to mark the unfinished. Perhaps it was meant for him to find, just as the telegram had been meant to summon. Both were signs not of absence, but of a peculiar invitation. He turned back. "We will return tonight, to the café, to the street. The telegram must be answered not with suspicion, but with presence. Whoever sent it will be watching. Perhaps they already are." Lucas looked doubtful. "But, Chief, if it is a trap?" "All summons are traps," Maigret said with a shrug. "That is their nature. What matters is whose snare we step into, and whether the snare is meant to hold us or to reveal itself." The office fell silent again. The inspector sat, smoke rising in slow spirals, his eyes half closed. He thought of the man with the ash-coloured gloves, his stride unhurried, his pauses deliberate, his whole figure constructed to be overlooked until it was too late. He thought of the woman, her hands trembling even in laughter, her eyes lowered when departure drew near. He thought of the café keeper, polishing glasses that never grew clean, her unease thick as the fog outside. And above all, he thought of the telegram, its words brief yet inexhaustible, a fragment whose very incompletion demanded pursuit. When the hour came, he rose. His coat smelled faintly of damp wool, his hat of tobacco smoke. He gathered the telegram, folded it into his wallet, and led Janvier and Lucas back into the night. The rain had thinned to drizzle, the streets slick and gleaming. Paris seemed hushed, expectant, as though waiting for the conclusion of its own unfinished sentence. The inspector's boot struck the pavement with deliberate weight, carrying him once more toward Rue des Martyrs, where danger waited not in action but in silence, not in violence but in the refusal to speak. And as they walked, Maigret felt again that peculiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct that told him he was moving not toward a resolution, but toward a deepening, a widening of shadows where the truth would resist until pressed beyond endurance. The telegram burned like a coal in his pocket. It had summoned him, and he would answer, not with haste, but with that same stubborn patience that had broken so many silences before. The morning broke grey but restless, the kind of Paris morning when the streets seem awake before the people who tread them. Newsboys darted through puddles, their cries sharper than the bells of the churches, each voice trying to cut through the damp air with the urgency of fresh headlines. The city was already humming with speculation, though little of it had any anchor in fact. At the kiosks, clusters of men hunched under umbrellas, pages spread and rustling, their conversations punctuated by the shake of a match and the mutter of disapproval. The press had found its scent, though what it chased was not the truth, but the aroma of intrigue. And it was Maigret's name, though never printed outright, that threaded through the rumours, like smoke signalling from behind closed shutters. At the Quai des Orfèvres, copies of the morning papers lay scattered on desks, their ink still smelling of the presses. One bore a headline about mysterious gatherings in Montmartre cafés. Another hinted at foreign agents moving through provincial towns under assumed identities. The most lurid claimed that a woman in mourning attire had been seen boarding trains without luggage, accompanied by men whose faces she never acknowledged. Each story claimed to have been overheard, glimpsed, or pieced together from whispers. None carried the ring of certainty, yet together they formed an echo chamber that could drown any quieter truth. Maigret sat heavy at his desk, pipe in hand, reading without haste, his expression one of weary recognition. He had seen it before, the moment when rumour left the alleys and took up residence in print, where it grew fat and immovable. Janvier entered with damp hair and an expression soured by too little sleep. He threw a copy of Le Petit Parisien onto the desk. "They've made it a drama already, Chief. Listen to this. The inspector, whose name we need not mention, has been sighted haunting the Rue des Martyrs, drawn by clandestine meetings that hint at scandal as much as crime." He spat the words with disgust, as if they sit on his shoulder watching. Maigret exhaled a ribbon of smoke, neither amused nor irritated. "Let them write. The press has its own appetite. It feeds on fragments, the way pigeons feed on crumbs. What matters is who placed the crumbs." His thick fingers tapped the folded telegram, still on his blotter like a relic of greater substance. Someone wanted the noise. Someone wanted this case to move from whispers into shouts. Lucas leaned from his corner, where he had been quietly taking notes. "But why, Chief? The people who write these things, they don't care for facts. Why would anyone want to throw shadows this wide? To make us chase shadows instead of men," Maigret said. He looked out the window at the leaden sky over the Seine. "Or to make someone else believe they are seen, pursued, surrounded, when in truth they are alone. Fear can be sown like wheat, Lucas. The press are only the wind." By mid-morning, a delegation of journalists had installed themselves outside the police headquarters, their notebooks fat in their pockets, their breath clouding in the damp. They smoked, they argued, they waited, certain that some morsel would fall from the inspector's table if they held their vigil long enough. Maigret passed them once on his way to a café across the street, his face unreadable, his gait heavy but not slow. He neither denied nor confirmed, neither frowned nor smiled. and in that silence they found what they wanted, confirmation enough to keep their pens busy. He knew the game. A denial was as nourishing as a confession, and often more so. It was at a corner café that Maigret encountered the first rumour made flesh. A man with a thin moustache, reeking of cheap cologne, leaned over his table toward two companions and whispered of secret telegrams, of spies in Beauvais, of women luring policemen into traps. His voice carried just enough for nearby ears. Maigret, seated a few tables away with his back to the wall, let the words reach him without acknowledgement. He recognized the type, a self-appointed informer, eager to claim knowledge, eager to borrow weight from the presence of others. Such men often proved useful without ever knowing it. They scattered details like seed, and one could always tell which handful had been provided to them deliberately. The inspector puffed on his pipe and ordered another coffee. He listened, not for truth, but for tone, and in that tone he heard the unmistakable mark of guidance. Someone had whispered to this man already, planting the story so it would blossom here. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, more newspapers had arrived, their second,
editions thick with embellishment. Now the story had expanded. There were tales of coded messages sent from railway stations, of provincial hotels serving as rendezvous points, of foreigners whose accents betrayed origins east of the Rhine. The war had ended years ago, but its shadows lingered, and the press loved nothing more than to resurrect them. The inspector read them all methodically, as one might read witness statements, not for accuracy, but for the single phrase that might betray authorship. And when he read, buried in a column on the third page of a lesser paper, the phrase "unfinished conversations," his pipe stopped halfway to his lips. It was not a phrase journalists would invent. Too abstract, too poetic for their trade. It belonged to the telegram, to the words written in haste on damp paper. And here it was, reappearing in print, as if someone wanted to prove they held the thread of his private summons. He tapped the column with his forefinger, summoning Lucas and Janvier. Here, who fed them this? The younger men leaned in, frowning. It could only have come from someone in the office, Janvier said with unease. Or someone listening close enough to you, Chief. Not from me, Maigret muttered, eyes narrowing. Not from you. His gaze swept the room, over clerks and officers bent at their ledgers, over typists hammering away with untroubled rhythm. Someone wishes to draw us out, to make us act as if the case already belongs to the public. They turn our silence into spectacle. For the rest of the day, the inspector moved less like a policeman and more like a man pacing through a theatre, gauging which seats were filled with loyal spectators and which with spies. He said little, but his silence weighed heavier than his words. By late afternoon, he returned to Rue des Martyrs. There, too, the press had made itself felt. A journalist loitered by the pharmacy, pretending to read the labels in the window. Another stood at the café door, hat tilted low, feigning interest in the menu chalked on the wall. Their presence distorted the air, making locals stiffen, making genuine conversations harder to hear. The café keeper glared at them but dared not protest. Business depended on discretion, and discretion had fled the room. Inside, the tables hummed with speculation. Students joked about being mistaken for conspirators. An old man in the corner claimed to have seen the inspector following a veiled woman down the street. The woman with trembling hands did not appear. Nor did the man with ash-coloured gloves. The absence of both felt louder than the chatter. Maigret sat near the stove, pipe between his teeth, pretending to read a newspaper whose ink smeared against his fingers. He watched. He waited, he listened, and in the press of rumour he found only one truth. Someone had chosen to widen the circle, to ensure that the case could not remain in shadow. Whoever they were, they wanted attention. They
wanted the city to murmur and the inspector to move under watchful eyes. When he left the café, the fog of evening had descended again, thick and low, hugging the pavement. The lamps glowed faintly, halos against the mist. Across the way he saw one of the journalists scribbling in his notebook, wet paper bending under his pencil. Maigret stood for a moment, watching, then turned away, pipe smoke curling from his lips. He did not resent the press. They were doing their part, unknowingly. In magnifying the fragments, they made the unfinished louder, and the louder it became, the sooner the silence would break. The inspector walked back toward the Seine, heavy-shouldered, pipe aglow. Paris whispered in 1,000 voices, none certain, all insistent, and in that whisper he heard the unfinished conversation, growing not quieter but louder, demanding its conclusion. The train rattled northward through a landscape blurred by mist, its windows streaked with rain that had not yet made up its mind to end. The compartment smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, and Maigret sat hunched in the corner, pipe extinguished by regulation, his eyes fixed on the countryside sliding past. Villages appeared and vanished, clusters of red roofs, a church spire, a yard of laundry shivering in the drizzle. Each scene carried the heaviness of provincial life, where days stretched long and rumours stretched longer. He had always known that the truth of Parisian cases often lay buried far from the boulevards, in towns where secrets festered quietly until they found their way back to the capital, disguised as gossip. And now the echo of the telegram had led him here, to Beauvais and its neighbouring towns, where the name of a street in Montmartre was whispered with a puzzling familiarity. When he descended at the station, the air was thicker, sharper with coal dust, as if every breath had been seasoned by the locomotives that idled there. The station itself was smaller than the echo of Gare du Nord, but it carried the same perfume of transience, voices raised in farewell, the shuffle of boots on damp stone, the thin wail of a whistle. A few faces turned toward him, curious, cautious. The presence of a Paris inspector in such a place was never invisible. Maigret lit his pipe the moment he cleared the doors, ignoring the frowns of provincial propriety, and let the smoke curl above him like a flag. He did not mind being noticed. Sometimes being noticed brought the very silence he sought. The town stretched in narrow streets that wound between shuttered houses, each smelling faintly of boiled cabbage or coal fires. Children ran along the gutter, their wooden shoes clattering, and old women in aprons paused from scrubbing steps to watch him pass. He found a café near the square, its windows fogged by the breath of men who lingered long after their drinks. Inside, warmth clung to the walls, mixed with the odour of beer that had seen too many spills. The keeper eyed him without, welcome, but served him a glass of the local white wine, thin and sharp, poured with a hand that shook less from fear than from the weight of habit. He took a seat near the stove, pipe between his teeth, and listened. The conversations, though low, carried a refrain he recognized. Twice he heard mention of the Paris man, always in a tone half distrustful, half awed. Once he heard the word martyrs drift across the room, spoken by a man whose hands trembled too much for his age. The inspector did not look up, only let the words drift to him. When he finished his wine, he asked casually, "Is there a lodging-house here where travellers from Paris stay? A modest one, near the station?" The café keeper frowned, uncertain whether to answer, but something in Maigret's manner, calm, inevitable, drew the truth out. "The Hôtel des Voyageurs," he muttered, "but it is nothing. Rooms for salesmen, peddlers, nothing more." Maigret thanked him with a nod and rose. He left a coin heavier than the price of the wine, not as generosity but as reminder. Paris had passed through and Paris did not forget. The Hôtel des Voyageurs stood 2 streets away, its sign swinging in the drizzle, its entrance narrow and unadorned. The clerk, a thin woman with grey hair pulled into a knot, looked up from her knitting with suspicion. He asked for a room, and though her mouth tightened, she handed him a key. He carried no bag, but she did not comment. Such places thrived on silence. The room smelled of old plaster and damp sheets. From its window he could see the station roof, smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. He lit his pipe, sat at the table, and spread before him the 2 scraps he carried always now, the telegram and the note from the hotel room in Paris. He read them as one reads prayers, not for revelation, but for rhythm. Outside, footsteps passed in the street, muffled by the mist. A cart rattled, a horse snorted, and then came the sound he had expected, voices lowered in the corridor, the shuffle of someone pausing too near his door. He rose, opened it suddenly, and caught the figure of the landlady herself, standing with a tray she had no reason to carry. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "I thought you might like hot water," she said. He regarded her for a long moment. "You thought wrong," he replied, closing the door. He knew the type, guardians of silence who pretended ignorance but listened too closely. She would report his presence to someone before nightfall, perhaps already had. He tamped his pipe, struck a match, and exhaled slowly, letting the smoke settle like a curtain between him and the echo that pressed around him. That evening he returned to the café. The same men sat at the same tables, their glasses no fuller, their conversations looping like weather vanes. But when he entered, a hush fell. He felt it at once. He had become the story now, his presence, the echo they had awaited. One of the men raised his glass in mock salute, then lowered his gaze quickly when Maigret's eyes met his. The inspector seated himself without comment. He did not order at once. He let them stew in their discomfort, the way meat tenderizes in its own juices. At last, one spoke. "You are from Paris," he said, not as a question, but as accusation. "I am," Maigret answered. "You look for someone?" "I listen," Maigret replied, and the vagueness unsettled them more than if he had accused outright. The man nodded slowly, eyes darting to his companions. "There was a woman. She came 2 nights ago, pale, nervous, stayed at the Hôtel des Voyageurs, left before dawn, no luggage." Another added quickly, "She spoke of Paris. She asked of trains, of Montmartre. She paid with damp notes. We said nothing." Maigret inclined his head, as if these details were mere garnish. He lit his pipe, drew in the smoke, and let it out with deliberate slowness. "And the man?" he asked finally. A pause. Then, "Gloves," the first muttered. Ash-coloured gloves. He was with her, not always, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but with her. The inspector nodded again. The echo had grown louder. It was no longer confined to Paris. It had spread into the provinces, reverberating in the mouths of men who had no part in it, but could not resist repeating what they had seen. He finished his wine, set the coin down, and rose. Outside, the mist had thickened, swallowing the lamps until only their halos remained. The town felt smaller, its streets tighter, as though the very stones strained under the weight of unspoken things. Back in his room, he wrote a brief note to Lucas, instructing him to check the railway registers for tickets purchased under false names, and to do so without drawing the attention of the press. He sealed it, left it with the clerk, and returned to his window. The square below was deserted. Only the fountain in its centre moved, its trickle louder in the night air. He smoked until the room blurred, his eyes heavy but his mind alert. The provincial echo had revealed itself, the woman, the gloves, the unfinished, but it had revealed nothing of why. And in that absence, Maigret sensed the weight of something larger, something that stretched beyond one café, one telegram, one town. He closed the window at last, shut out the mist, and sat heavily on the bed. The springs creaked like voices trying to rise and failing. He let his pipe go out, folded his arms across his chest, and stared into the darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, in the echo that stretched between Paris and Beauvais, the truth waited. And when it came, it would not come gently. It would arrive like a storm breaking through silence, shattering the comfort of unfinished words. The train bore him back toward Paris through a night thick with fog, the carriage rocking gently, lantern lights swaying in tired arcs across the compartment. Maigret sat alone, pipe extinguished in deference to the rules, his broad hands folded across his knees and his eyes closed, not in sleep but in thought. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails lulled lesser men into slumber, but for him it drew up memories, coaxing them from where they had lodged, as persistent as the rain that clung to every pane of glass. He returned, unwillingly but insistently, to that first evening in the café on Rue des Martyrs. Every detail of the room replayed itself with new sharpness, as if the provincial echo he had pursued had thrown back a light upon the shadows he had once dismissed. The clatter of chess pieces, the laughter of students too brittle to be careless, the café keeper's cloth forever circling the same glass, it all returned, but altered. In memory, the conversations rose and fell like the tide, fragments washing against him with words he now recognized had been signals, not idle chatter. The woman at the window, gloved hands folded, waiting with a patience that was nearer to despair than expectation. The man who joined her, gloves ash-coloured, movements deliberate, each gesture rehearsed. He remembered how their conversation had broken off the moment laughter entered the door, how silence had fallen like a curtain, leaving only a residue of unfinished meaning. At the time, he had noted it only as atmosphere. Now he saw it for what it was, the beginning of everything, the place where truth had cracked but not yet burst. He thought, too, of the scarf left behind in the hotel room, perfumed still though damp, a trace of intimacy abandoned with deliberation. And of the note, "Not tonight. Another time, do not follow." It was not refusal, it was postponement. In the café, he had overlooked the weight of postponement, had mistaken hesitation for fragility. Now he understood that in their world, delay was not weakness but strategy. To keep words unfinished was to keep choices alive. Those who concluded too quickly found themselves trapped. Those who left their sentences suspended retained freedom, and in freedom lay both danger and survival. The train slowed as it reached the outskirts of the city. Gas lamps glowed faintly through the fog, pale halos trembling in the night air. Maigret rose, heavy-shouldered, gathered his coat, and prepared himself. He knew where he was going, though he had not spoken it aloud, back to the café, to the source, to the unfinished conversation that had wound its echo through telegrams, train stations, provincial whispers, and now circled back upon itself. It was time not to chase further, but to listen once more where it had all begun. Rue des Martyrs smelled of wet stone and coal smoke when he arrived. The hour was late. Most shops had shuttered. The few passers-by hurried with heads down, collars raised. The café still glowed with its familiar yellow light, condensation blurring its windows. He stood a moment under the awning, pipe glowing faintly, watching the silhouettes within. The keeper moved with her cloth, unchanged, eternal. A couple of students bent again over their board as though time itself had looped. And in the corner by the window, a solitary figure sat, hat set aside, gloves resting upon the table. The inspector entered quietly, taking his old seat by the stove. He ordered Calvados in the same rough voice, and the keeper brought it without comment, her eyes darting once toward the man by the window. Maigret did not need to follow her gaze. He had already seen. The ash-coloured gloves lay there like a confession, their fingertips lined in shadow. The man himself was older than memory had painted him, though not old. His hair receding, his shoulders drawn in as though protecting a chest hollowed by worry. He held a cigarette between his fingers, but it burned low, forgotten, the ash trembling on its tip. He looked not at the door, but at the glass, beyond which the street lay silent, fog pressed against the pane. Maigret drank slowly, smoke curling from his pipe. He did not approach, not yet. Instead, he let memory align itself with present, the room's details clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. The students' laughter again broke off too suddenly. The old men argued without force. The keeper's hand circled her glass with an unease that belonged not to habit, but to vigilance. The café was not a place of chance, it was a stage, and its actors repeated their roles until the inspector learned his lines. The man with the gloves lifted his glass, drank, and set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. His precision was weary but unbroken. Maigret recognized it, the precision of a man who holds chaos at bay by measuring each gesture. He watched him, not with suspicion, but with the quiet gravity that had broken stronger men than this. At last their eyes met. The man did not start, did not flinch, but something passed across his face, an acknowledgment, a sigh, perhaps even relief. The inspector rose then, carrying his Calvados, and crossed the room. He seated himself opposite the man without invitation. For a long moment neither spoke. The smoke from Maigret's pipe drifted upward, mingling with the haze of cigarettes above them. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels splashing water into the gutter. "You came back," the man said finally, his voice low, accented faintly with the provinces. "I never left," Maigret replied, and the words carried the weight of truth. For even in Beauvais, even in his own kitchen, he had remained here, in this café, in this unfinished room. The man looked at his gloves, fingers tapping lightly upon them. "It was not meant for you," he said. "The telegram, it was meant for her." Maigret puffed his pipe, unhurried. "Yet it reached me." "Yes." The man's eyes lowered, "because she would not come." Silence stretched between them, filled with the noise of other voices, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs. And in that silence, Maigret felt the café itself press upon him, its memory reasserting itself, every detail insisting upon being seen again. The scarf, the note, the trembling hands, the refusal to finish sentences. It was not merely a case of lovers or conspirators. It was a world constructed upon the unfinished, a world where words half-spoken protected more fiercely than words declared. At last, Maigret leaned forward, his heavy hand resting upon the table. "You wished to be seen," he said softly. "Else you would not have worn gloves in weather that asked for bare hands. Else you would not have sat here by the window where every passer-by could notice. You wished to be seen, and you wished for her to answer." The man closed his eyes briefly, as though the inspector's words carried a weight he had carried alone too long. "And she did not," he whispered. "No," Maigret said. "She postponed, always postponed, and postponement is its own kind of refusal." The man nodded slowly. His fingers tightened upon the gloves, wringing them as though they might yield confession. The inspector sat back, letting the silence return. He did not push. He knew the truth would not burst forth tonight, not in words, not in confessions. But the café had returned in memory, and memory had become present, and present was heavy enough to break what silence could not. They sat together, the inspector and the man with the ash-coloured gloves, while the café murmured around them. Neither spoke again. They did not need to. For in that room, everything unfinished had already declared itself, and Maigret knew that the truth, whatever shape it took, would no longer be denied its conclusion. The fog had thickened by the time Maigret left the café, a near-solid mass that crept up the street like the breath of the city itself. The lamps, scattered in weak intervals along Rue des Martyrs, flickered dimly, casting long shadows that bent and curved, swallowed by the thickening mist. There was no hurry in Maigret's step. His boots struck the cobblestones with a deliberate, steady rhythm, the echo swallowed by the damp air. Behind him the café door clicked shut with an almost final sound, though he knew it was no more final than the first time he'd crossed its threshold. Everything had happened before. It was always just a matter of when, a matter of time, bending back on itself until it reached the point where it could no longer return. He had learned what he needed to know. The man with the ash-coloured gloves had spoken little, but he had said enough. The woman's absence, her delay, her refusal to answer, these things were not symptoms of fear, but of something far more complex, something that had been set in motion long before Maigret had ever stepped onto the scene. He had followed the threads of a broken conversation, piecing together fragments, but now he realized that what mattered was not the gap between what was said and what was unsaid. It was the place where the gap itself lived. The tall silence, the stillness, had been a choice. A decision made not in the heat of a moment, but over time, until it had accumulated weight. The silence had shaped the events, not the other way around. Maigret crossed the street, turning his back on the café and letting his gaze drift down the darkened boulevard. The sound of his footsteps faded, muffled by the fog, and he felt as though he were walking through a world not quite real, as though the very stones beneath him were softening and melting into the mist. He reached the corner and paused for a moment, glancing back at the hotel across the street. The faint glow of a lamp from the second floor illuminated a window, casting a rectangle of light on the sidewalk below. Someone was watching. He could feel it. The shadows clung too tightly to the edges of the building, and the light was too controlled, too deliberate. Someone was waiting for something, but who? It wasn't just the man with the gloves or the woman who had vanished into the evening. It wasn't just the telegram that had pulled him here, or the rumors in the press that had filled the air with whispers. It was something else. Something older, something that had been circling the streets of Paris for longer than Maigret cared to acknowledge. The city had a way of holding on to things. It had a way of storing up the past until it came back to haunt you, pulling you back into old corners, into old memories, into unfinished business. He turned away from the hotel, moving through the fog toward the Seine, his mind shifting gears as it always did when the end of a case was close. He needed to think. Not about the telegram, not about the press, not about the people who had crossed his path. He needed to think about the silence, the way it had settled over everything like a blanket that could not be lifted. The way it had shaped the case, the way it had driven the man to reach out in the first place, to try to make contact, to leave clues where none had been expected. The river was still, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing boat, its presence unnoticed by most of the city as it slumbered beneath the fog. Maigret leaned against the stone railing of the bridge, his gaze fixed on the water, his thoughts swirling like the mist that hung low in the air. He had been here before, at this very spot, listening to the river, letting its calm seep into his bones. It had always been a place of quiet reflection, a place to watch the current without feeling the need to chase it. And now, standing here again, he felt the weight of years upon him, the weight of decisions made and not made, the weight of lives altered by simple choices, by words spoken or not spoken. A figure appeared on the far side of the bridge, its outline blurred by the fog. Maigret's first instinct was to move back into the shadows, to let the figure pass without notice. But then the figure stopped, standing motionless, as though it too had been waiting for something. The inspector stood still, his hands resting loosely in his coat pockets, his eyes never leaving the shape of the person who stood across the bridge. The figure shifted slightly, and Maigret saw it was a woman, her silhouette softened by the mist. She did not move toward him, she did not look in his direction, but he felt her presence, the way a shadow feels the weight of its own darkness. The air between them hung thick, and for a long moment neither moved. The river gurgled beneath them, its steady sound a counterpoint to the stillness. Maigret knew this moment. It was not the first time he had found himself at the edge of a case like this, at the edge of something that could not be neatly finished. He had seen it before in other faces, in other streets. The moment when everything stopped, when all the threads came together but still refused to connect. It was the moment when a choice had been made, but the result remained suspended, hanging between them. The woman turned, her coat brushing against the mist, and began to walk toward the end of the bridge. Maigret's pulse quickened. The instinct to follow stirred in him, but he did not move. He simply stood there, watching, letting the moments stretch out, feeling the weight of his own silence pressing back against the weight of hers. She walked with purpose, her head held high, as though she had made a decision and had already accepted its consequences. Maigret did not follow her. Instead, he turned back to the river, his mind still working through the fragments of the case, through the clues that had led him here, through the man and the woman, the telegram and the press, the whispers and the silence. He had arrived at something, he knew that. But it was not the end, it was not the conclusion. It was just another part of the puzzle, another piece that had to fit into place before the truth could be revealed. The fog closed in around him as he stood there, the river stretching out before him like a path leading into the unknown. The night felt endless, as though it could stretch on forever, carrying him forward into whatever was waiting on the other side. But Maigret knew better than to hurry. The answers would come in time. The silence would break when it was ready. And when it did, he would be here, waiting. For now, there was only the fog, the river, and the quiet hum of a city that would never stop whispering its secrets, no matter how far the mist reached or how dark the night became.